A woman in a simple dress is publicly humiliated, called a clueless maid, and told to use the back door by an arrogant wedding guest. The guest then calls security to have her physically thrown out. But what this cruel woman doesn't know is that the person she just insulted is a secret billionaire who just hours earlier bought the entire $1 million venue. And now she's about to teach her a lesson in humility that no one in that room will ever forget. Before we find out what happens next, let us know in the comments what city you're watching from. And if this story is already hitting home, make sure you hit that like button. The grand entrance of the Sterling Grand Manor was designed to impress. Towering marble columns flanked a set of heavy polished oak doors, and a crimson carpet flowed from the curb to the entrance like a river of velvet. It was a place built for declarations, for celebrations that cost more than most people's homes. Guests arrived in a procession of gleaming luxury cars, their expensive perfumes and hushed, important-sounding voices filling the opulent lobby. Naomi Carter arrived in a modest sedan that the valet almost overlooked. She stepped out, not in a glittering gown, but in a simple dark blue linen dress, her hair tied back in a neat bun. In one hand, she carried a plain black garment bag, the kind a dry cleaner might use. She looked neat, professional, and entirely out of place among the sea of diamonds and designer suits. As she stepped through the grand doors, a woman with a perfectly coiffed blonde bob and a gaze as sharp as broken glass zeroed in on her. This was Margaret Whitmore, mother of the groom, and the self-appointed queen of this extravagant affair. Her dress was a sheath of silver silk that shimmered with every slight movement, and the diamond necklace at her throat caught the light from the crystal chandeliers, scattering it like tiny cold stars. She saw Naomi, and her face instantly soured, twisting into a mask of disdain. Margaret glided over, her heels clicking an angry rhythm on the marble floor. She didn't slow down, forcing Naomi to take a step back to avoid a collision. "Excuse me." Margaret's voice was low and frosted with contempt. She gestured vaguely toward a discreet door at the far end of the lobby. "The staff entrance is around the back. You should know better than to come through the front where the real guests are." The words were spoken just loudly enough for the cluster of nearby guests to hear. A few of them turned, their eyes flicking over Naomi's simple dress and the garment bag she held. A man in a tailored tuxedo chuckled under his breath. A woman whispered to her companion, and both of them smirked. The air crackled with their shared amusement and judgment. They saw exactly what Margaret wanted them to see, a lowly worker who didn't know her place. Naomi's face remained a perfect mask of calm. She didn't flush with anger or stammer out a defense. Her eyes, a deep and intelligent brown, simply met Margaret's, and for a fraction of a second she held her gaze. Inside, a quiet mechanism clicked on. She wasn't just observing. She was recording. Every sneer, every whisper, every condescending glance was being filed away. She had come here for a reason, and Margaret Whitmore was proving her point more beautifully than she could have ever imagined. Without a word, Naomi gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod and turned away, letting the insult hang in the air, unanswered. Margaret watched her go, a triumphant little smile playing on her lips. She had corrected an error, put an inferior in her place. She felt a surge of satisfaction. But Naomi's silence was not the silence of submission. It was the silence of a predator that has just seen its prey walk willingly into a trap. Margaret, puffed up with her own importance, felt nothing but victory. She had no idea that she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. She turned back to her guests, basking in their quiet approval, completely unaware that she had just insulted the single most powerful person in the entire building. The silence from Naomi was not weakness. It was the quiet before a storm that Naomi herself was about to summon. Margaret's satisfaction was fleeting. The simple fact that the woman in the plain dress had not groveled or apologized grated on her nerves. The quiet compliance felt like a form of defiance. How dare she just walk away? Contempt, curdled into a sharper, more active anger. Margaret's perfectly painted lips thinned into a hard line. This wasn't enough. The woman needed to be removed entirely. She needed to be taught a lesson she wouldn't forget. With a flick of her wrist, she signaled to one of the venue's uniformed security guards standing near the entrance. The guard, a burly man named Thomas with a weary expression, approached her dutifully. "Yes, Mrs. Whitmore?" "That woman," Margaret said, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at Naomi, who had stopped near a corridor leading away from the main hall. "She's not a guest. She's some kind of cleaning staff or a delivery person who clearly doesn't understand the rules. I want her removed. Escort her out. Through the back, of course." Her tone left no room for discussion. It was an order, not a request. The guard's eyes followed her finger to Naomi. He saw a woman standing quietly, causing no trouble. He hesitated for a moment. "Ma'am, is she causing a disturbance?" Margaret's eyes flashed with indignation. "Her presence is a disturbance. This is an exclusive event. We are paying a fortune for this venue, and I will not have it cheapened by clueless staff wandering through the main entrance. Do your job and remove her." At the far side of the lobby, near the grand staircase, the wedding party was assembled. The groom, Daniel Whitmore, Margaret's son, glanced over. He was a man who looked handsome in his tuxedo, but seemed somehow diminished, his shoulders slightly stooped as if under an invisible weight. He saw his mother dressing down the security guard and pointing at the woman in blue. He saw the tension. A flicker of something. Annoyance, perhaps, or shame crossed his face, but it was gone as quickly as it came. He looked away, turning his attention to adjusting his cufflinks. It was easier not to get involved. His mother always won these battles, and challenging her only made things worse for everyone, especially for him. Beside him stood the bride, Alyssa. Her face, framed by a delicate lace veil, was a portrait of quiet distress. She saw the scene unfolding, and her hands, clutching her bouquet of white roses, tightened until her knuckles were white. This was not what she wanted for her wedding day. She hated confrontation, and she especially hated the casual cruelty her mother-in-law wielded like a weapon. But Margaret's personality was a force of nature, a hurricane that Alyssa had long ago learned to ride out rather than stand against. Speaking up would only invite that storm upon herself. So she stayed silent, a beautiful, powerless statue in an ivory dress, her discomfort a secret she kept locked behind a practiced, placid smile. Not everyone was so passive. A young waitress named Emily was polishing wine glasses at a nearby service station, and she had seen the whole exchange. Her movements slowed, then stopped. A knot of anger and injustice tightened in her stomach. She was a student, working this job to pay for tuition, and she knew the sting of being treated as invisible, as less than. She saw the woman in the blue dress, who looked dignified and calm, being targeted for no reason other than that she didn't look rich enough. Emily's heart went out to her. She wanted to say something, to tell Mrs. Whitmore to leave the woman alone, but the fear of losing her job, of causing a scene that would get her fired on the spot, kept her feet rooted to the floor. Her hands trembled slightly as she watched the security guard reluctantly begin to walk toward Naomi. Naomi saw the guard approaching. She didn't wait for him to speak. With a final, unreadable glance toward Margaret, she turned and took a few steps toward a side exit, a small, discreet door used by catering staff. She moved without haste, her posture erect and her movements deliberate. It wasn't a retreat. It was a strategic repositioning. By stepping aside willingly, she drained the confrontation of its power. She denied Margaret the spectacle of having her forcibly removed. She was still in control, a fact that was utterly lost on Margaret, who saw only a lowly worker finally scurrying away as commanded. Naomi's quiet exit was a move in a much larger game, a game whose rules only she understood. She disappeared through the door, leaving Margaret to preen in her victory, completely oblivious to the fact that the checkmate was already being planned. As the door clicked shut behind Naomi, the audience was let in on a secret, a truth so potent it reframed everything that had just happened. The woman in the simple blue dress, the one mistaken for a maid and dismissed as a nobody, was Dr. Naomi Carter. And she was not staff. She was not a guest. She was, as of 9 o'clock that very morning, the owner, not just of the Sterling Grand Manor, but of the entire portfolio of luxury properties to which it belonged. She was the founder and CEO of Carter Holdings, a multi-billion-dollar global corporation known for its aggressive but brilliant acquisitions in the hospitality and real estate sectors. The name Carter was whispered with a mixture of awe and fear in boardrooms across the world. To the public, however, Naomi Carter was a ghost. She loathed the spotlight, rarely gave interviews, and the few photos of her that existed online were years out of date. She moved through the world with a calculated anonymity, a powerful figure hiding in plain sight. Just hours before, in a sterile, glass-walled conference room miles away, Naomi had signed the final papers on a deal worth $300 million. The acquisition of the Sterling Hotel Group had been swift, silent, and decisive, hallmarks of a Naomi Carter operation. The ink on the contracts was barely dry. The previous owners were likely on a plane to a private island celebrating their golden parachute, and the venue's on-site management hadn't even received the official transition memo yet. For all intents and purposes, for the next few hours, Naomi Carter was a phantom ruler, walking through a kingdom that was already hers, though none of its inhabitants knew it yet. She held all the power, a secret she wielded with the quiet confidence of someone who had built an empire from nothing. The garment bag she carried didn't hold a uniform. It held a custom-tailored power suit, ready for the moment she decided to reveal herself. Her decision to come here today, dressed down and unannounced, was no accident. It was a test. Naomi's motives ran deeper than simple corporate due diligence. Her undercover visit was a personal mission, born from a past she rarely spoke of but never forgot. Long before she was Dr. Carter, the billionaire CEO, she was just Naomi, a scholarship kid at a prestigious university, surrounded by the kind of inherited wealth and casual arrogance she saw radiating from Margaret Whitmore. She remembered the sting of being overlooked in class discussions, the subtle sneers at her second-hand coat, the sting of being told by a classmate that people like her were only there to fill a quota. One incident in particular had burned itself into her memory. During a university fundraising gala, she had worked as a server to earn extra money. The father of a classmate, a powerful trustee, had spilled a glass of red wine on his own shirt, and then loudly and publicly blamed her, calling her clumsy and incompetent. He demanded she be fired on the spot. Her manager, fearing the trustee's influence, had complied. Naomi had walked home that night, humiliated and powerless, but with a cold fire ignited in her soul. She had vowed that day that if she ever achieved a position of power, she would never forget what it felt like to be on the other side. She would build her empire on a foundation of respect, not fear. And she would use her influence to expose the rot of arrogance that so often festered in the world of the elite. She believed that a person's true character wasn't revealed in how they treated their equals or their superiors, but in how they treated the people they believed had no power over them. The waitress, the janitor, the security guard, the woman in a simple dress they mistook for a maid. So, when the acquisition of the Sterling Hotel Group was finalized, she saw an opportunity. She had read the file on the Whitmore wedding. Margaret Whitmore was listed as a platinum-tier client, known for her extravagant spending and her notoriously difficult demands. She was the perfect subject for Naomi's real-world character test. Naomi had come here today not just to inspect her new property, but to hold a mirror up to the people within it. She wanted to see with her own eyes the soul of the place she had just bought. And in Margaret Whitmore, that soul was revealing itself to be ugly, entitled, and perfectly wonderfully ripe for a lesson in humility. In a quiet service corridor, away from the glittering party, Naomi leaned against a cool wall and took a slow, steadying breath. The anger she felt was a familiar cold weight in her chest, but it was a controlled anger, one she had learned to channel into fuel. As she stood there, the small, discreet door she had exited through creaked open. The young waitress, Emily, slipped into the hallway, her face pale with anxiety. She clutched a tray of empty glasses to her chest like a shield. "Excuse me," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. I just wanted to say, I'm so sorry about what happened out there. What she said to you, it was awful. It wasn't right." Naomi looked at the young woman. She saw the genuine distress in her eyes, the nervous fidgeting of her hands. Here was the other side of the coin. For every Margaret, there was an Emily. For every act of casual cruelty, there was a quiet act of conscience. This was just as important to witness. Naomi offered a small, reassuring smile. The warmth of it seemed to surprise Emily, who had expected to be brushed off. "Thank you," Naomi said, her voice calm and even. "It takes courage to say that." Emily's shoulders relaxed slightly. "I wanted to say something, but I was afraid. She's Mrs. Whitmore. She gets people fired." "I understand," Naomi said, and the depth of meaning in those two simple words was profound. She did understand. She understood better than Emily could possibly know. She looked at the young waitress, seeing not just a server, but a person of integrity, an asset. "You don't have to say anything," Naomi continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "Just do your job, and keep your eyes open." The instruction was simple, yet it felt charged with significance. It wasn't a dismissal, it was an invitation. Keep your eyes open. Emily nodded, a sense of purpose solidifying within her. She felt like she had been enlisted in a secret mission. She gave Naomi a final, determined look before slipping back out into the grand hall, the empty glasses on her tray no longer rattling. Naomi watched her go, a flicker of hope tempering the cold anger in her heart. The test was not over. In fact, it had just truly begun. Emily returned to her duties, but something inside her had shifted. Naomi's words, "keep your eyes open," echoed in her mind. It was more than advice. It felt like a directive. She was no longer just a passive observer. She was a witness. Her guilt over her own silence transformed into a quiet resolve. She began to watch Margaret Whitmore not with fear, but with a new analytical focus. She saw Margaret snap at a busboy for being too slow to clear a plate, her voice a whip crack in the elegant room. She saw her complain loudly to the wedding planner that the champagne wasn't cold enough, demanding that the inferior brand be replaced immediately. Each act of arrogance was another piece of evidence. During a brief lull, Emily found two of her colleagues, a fellow waiter named Leo and a bartender named Chloe, huddled in the kitchen. She recounted the incident at the entrance, how Mrs. Whitmore had humiliated the woman in the blue dress and had security escort her away. Leo sighed, shaking his head as he polished a spoon. "Doesn't surprise me. The Whitmore family has an event here every year. She's always like that. Last year, she made a coat-check girl cry because she thought there was a smudge on her fur coat." "She treats us like we're not even human," Chloe added, pouring a line of drinks with sharp, angry movements. "She talks down to everyone. But what can you do? Management always sides with the rich clients, complain. And you're the one who ends up out of a job." Their words confirmed what Emily already felt. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern of behavior, a systemic abuse of power that everyone was too afraid to challenge. "Well, maybe that needs to change," Emily said, her voice firm. The fear was still there, a knot in her stomach, but it was now overshadowed by a stronger sense of purpose. She began to consciously document Margaret's behavior, not on paper but in her mind, creating a clear chronological list of offenses. The complaint about the champagne, the insult to the busboy, the dismissive wave she gave to a musician who tried to ask her a question. From a shadowed alcove across the grand hall, Naomi watched. She had re-entered the event space through another service door, blending into the periphery, a ghost at the feast. She saw Emily speaking with her colleagues. She saw the new determination in the young woman's posture. And as Emily went back to work, her eyes scanning the room with newfound intent, their gazes met for a fleeting moment across the crowd. Naomi gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. It was a silent message. I see you. You are doing the right thing. The alliance was forged, unspoken but unbreakable. Two women from two different worlds, now united in a quiet conspiracy against the tyranny of one. Buoyed by her perceived victory, Margaret Whitmore was holding court near the towering seven-tiered wedding cake. She was in her element, the center of attention, a champagne flute held delicately in her hand. The story of her confrontation with the staff member had become a source of amusement, a little anecdote she shared with her circle of wealthy guests to demonstrate her authority and her commitment to maintaining standards. "You simply cannot let them get away with it," she declared, her voice carrying a note of self-congratulatory pride. "The moment you let one of them think they can walk through the front door, the entire standard of the place collapses." I had to be firm. A portly man with a red face, a longtime business associate of her husband, chuckled. "Good for you, Margaret. Someone has to put them in their place." "Exactly," Margaret said, taking a triumphant sip of her champagne. "I told the security guard to remove her immediately. She was some sort of clueless maid, I imagine. Probably got lost. Can you imagine the nerve? People like that simply shouldn't be near millionaires during their private celebrations. It's a matter of security, of hygiene." The circle of guests murmured their agreement. They existed in a bubble of immense privilege, a world where service staff were part of the scenery, functional and preferably invisible. Margaret's actions weren't seen as cruel. They were seen as necessary, a simple pruning of the social garden. Standing just outside the circle, her son Daniel heard every word. He laughed, a short, awkward bark of a sound. It was the laugh of a man conditioned from birth to agree with his mother, to accept her world-view as law. But inside, a small, weary part of him cringed. He knew it was wrong. He knew it was needlessly cruel. But the path of least resistance was a well-worn groove in his life, and deviating from it was a thought too exhausting to entertain. His bride, Alyssa, stood beside him, her smile frozen on her face. She heard the words clueless maid and hygiene, and a wave of nausea washed over her. She felt like an accomplice to the cruelty. Her silence felt like a betrayal of her own values. She looked at Margaret, laughing and preening, and saw not a powerful matriarch, but a profoundly insecure woman who needed to belittle others to feel important. Alyssa's unease was growing, coalescing into a dark premonition. She felt a storm gathering on the horizon of her perfect wedding day, a storm that had nothing to do with the weather. She could feel it in the air, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, and she knew with a chilling certainty that Margaret's arrogance was about to have consequences. Margaret's ego, now fully inflated, propelled her on a tour of the grand hall. She moved from one group of guests to another, not just as the mother of the groom, but as the de facto ruler of the event. She pointed out the intricate floral arrangements she had personally approved, the specific vintage of the wine she had insisted upon. Her voice was a constant, confident murmur that wove its way through the polite chatter of the reception. She wanted everyone to know that this perfect evening was a direct result of her influence, her taste, her power. Stopping by a table of her oldest friends, she gestured expansively at the room around them. "It's a wonderful venue, isn't it?" she said, her tone implying that she was personally responsible for its existence. "Of course, I know the owners personally. We have a direct line to the top management. They know that when the Whitmores book an event, it has to be flawless. This venue is for people who deserve it, people who appreciate the finer things." The irony was thick enough to be cut with a cake knife. Here she was, standing in a room she didn't own, bragging about her connection to owners who were no longer in charge, all while disparaging the very person who now held the deed. She was a queen ruling over a kingdom, that had been sold right out from under her, and she was utterly, blissfully unaware. In a quiet corner, partially obscured by a large potted palm, Naomi Carter stood perfectly still. She wasn't hiding. She was simply observing, a silent witness to Margaret's grand performance of self-importance. She heard every boast, every classist remark. Each word was another nail Margaret hammered into her own coffin. Naomi's expression remained neutral, but inside the final pieces of her plan were clicking into place. She had seen enough. The test was complete. The results were in. Now it was time for the verdict. Naomi took one last look at Margaret, who was now laughing, her head thrown back, the diamonds on her neck flashing under the chandeliers. The image was a perfect portrait of hubris, of a person so blinded by their own privilege they couldn't see the cliff edge they were gleefully dancing upon. With a quiet final resolve, Naomi turned and slipped out of the grand hall, her movements as silent and purposeful as a shadow. The time for observation was over. The time for action had arrived. Naomi found what she was looking for: a quiet, wood-paneled hallway that led to the venue's administrative offices. The sounds of the party, the music, the laughter, the clinking of glasses faded behind her, replaced by a deep, expectant silence. The air here was still and cool. She pulled a sleek, minimalist smartphone from a hidden pocket in her dress. There was only one number she needed to call. She pressed a single contact on the screen labeled H. Cole. The phone didn't even have a chance to complete a full ring before it was answered. "Cole," a man's voice said, crisp and professional. There was no preamble, no greeting. Just the name. A statement of readiness. This was Harrison Cole, Naomi's chief security officer and most trusted right-hand man. He was a former military intelligence officer, a man of formidable calm and logistical genius. He was the one who executed her plans with surgical precision. Naomi's voice was low, her words measured and clear, leaving no room for misinterpretation. "Begin the transition," she said. The phrase was a prearranged code, the key that would turn the entire machine she had built. It meant the silent phase was over. It meant the acquisition was to be made official, on site, immediately. "Understood," Harrison replied without a flicker of hesitation. "I am 5 minutes out. The legal team is on standby 2 blocks away. All assets are in position." "Good," Naomi said. She glanced back down the hall toward the distant glow of the party. "I will remain anonymous until I step forward. I want the family gathered first. I want them waiting." "It will be done exactly as you specify, Dr. Carter," Harrison said. Naomi added one final instruction. "And Harrison, make sure the young waitress, the one named Emily, is treated as a priority asset. She is not to be alarmed. She is to be protected." "Consider her protected," he confirmed. Naomi ended the call. The entire conversation had taken less than 30 seconds. She slipped the phone back into her pocket. A quiet sense of finality settled over her. The first domino had been pushed. Now, all she had to do was wait and watch the rest of them fall. She took a deep breath, the calm returning to her, the cold, controlled anger now honed to a razor's edge. She turned and walked back toward the party, melting back into the shadows, a silent orchestrator ready for the final act of her opera. The change was so subtle at first that almost no one noticed it. An extra security guard appeared at the main entrance, his posture more rigid, his eyes more watchful than the event staff. Another 2 guards, dressed in sharp black suits with discreet earpieces, took up positions at either end of the main hall. They didn't look like typical venue security. They looked like federal agents. They moved with a quiet, synchronized efficiency that spoke of a higher level of training. The venue's on-site security manager, a man flustered by this sudden and unexplained reinforcement, was quietly taken aside and briefed. His face went from confused to stunned to deeply deferential in the space of a minute. Then, Harrison Cole arrived. He strode through the grand doors as if he owned the place. which as a proxy for Naomi, he essentially did. He was a tall, imposing man in a perfectly tailored dark gray suit. He carried a slim, locked briefcase. He did not look at the guests or the decorations. His focus was absolute. He was met by the venue's general manager, a man named Mr. Davies, who had been urgently summoned from his office. Harrison presented a single document. Mr. Davies read the first paragraph, and the color drained from his face. His hands began to shake. He looked up at Harrison Cole, his mouth opening and closing silently for a moment before he managed to stammer, I understand. We will give you our full cooperation." Whispers began to ripple through the staff. The bartenders, the waiters, the kitchen crew. They all felt the shift in the atmosphere. The air was now thick with a nervous, electric energy. "Did you see those guys in the suits?" one waiter whispered to another. "Something big is happening." Emily, clearing plates from a table, saw Harrison Cole speaking with the manager. She saw the manager's shocked expression. She felt a jolt of apprehension, but then she remembered Naomi's words and the subtle nod of acknowledgement. She felt a strange sense of calm descend upon her. She didn't know what was happening, but she had a feeling it was connected to the woman in the blue dress, and that for the first time, justice was on its way. Meanwhile, Margaret Whitmore remained completely oblivious. She was laughing with a friend about a recent trip to Europe, too absorbed in the sound of her own voice to notice the subtle tightening of the net around her. Her arrogance was a thick, soundproof wall, insulating her from the reality that was rapidly closing in. She was the star of a show that was about to be cancelled, and she hadn't even read the notice. Harrison Cole gave a crisp nod to Mr. Davies, the now pale venue manager. "Please, have your head of security escort the Whitmore family to the Regent Suite. Tell them the new ownership wishes to offer them a special welcome." The words were chosen with deliberate care, designed to appeal directly to Margaret's ego. The head of security, a man who now understood the gravity of the situation, approached Margaret's group. He adopted a posture of utmost respect. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his voice polite but firm, "excuse the interruption. We've been instructed to gather all key members of your party. The new ownership of the Sterling Group would like to extend a personal welcome to you in a private suite." Margaret's eyes lit up. New ownership? A personal welcome? Of course. It was perfectly logical. They must have heard about what a valued and important client she was. This was likely a special gift, a bottle of vintage champagne, perhaps, or an exclusive membership upgrade. It was a sign of respect, the kind of recognition she felt she so richly deserved. A smug, satisfied smile spread across her face. It's about time," she said to the guests at her table, who looked on with impressed expressions. She stood, smoothing down the front of her silver dress. "It seems the new owners know how to treat their most important clients." She turned to her son and his new wife. "Daniel, Alyssa, come along. It seems we're getting the VIP treatment." Daniel, ever obedient, immediately stood. Alyssa rose more slowly, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. This felt wrong. The stern-looking men in suits, the sudden formality. It didn't feel like a celebration, it felt like a summons. She glanced around the room, a desperate, searching look in her eyes, as if looking for an escape. But there was none. Flanked by security, Margaret led her small family procession through the grand hall, her head held high, walking confidently toward her own downfall. She was so blinded by her arrogance, she couldn't see that the velvet rope being lifted for her was not for a VIP lounge, but for a courtroom where she was about to be the one on trial. The Regent Suite was not a room for celebration. It was one of the venue's high-level boardrooms, a space designed for tense negotiations and serious decisions. A long, polished mahogany table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by imposing leather chairs. The lighting was stark and professional, a stark contrast to the warm, festive glow of the wedding reception. There were no flowers, no champagne. Instead, there were several people waiting in silence. At the head of the table sat Harrison Cole, his locked briefcase placed squarely in front of him. Flanking him were two men and a woman in severe business suits, lawyers from Carter Holdings' legal team. The venue's general manager, Mr. Davies, stood nervously by the wall, wringing his hands. The air was heavy and still. Margaret Whitmore swept into the room, her confident stride faltering for the first time. This was not what she had expected. Her smile tightened at the edges. "Well," she said, her voice a little too loud in the silent room, "this is a rather formal welcome." She scanned the unfamiliar, stern faces, looking for someone to flatter, someone to charm. But the faces that looked back at her were impassive, their expressions unreadable slates. Daniel looked confused, glancing from Harrison Cole to his mother, waiting for a cue on how to react. Alyssa, however, felt a cold wave of certainty wash over her. Her premonition had been right. This was the storm, and it was about to break. Margaret, refusing to cede control, addressed Harrison directly. "I assume you're in charge here. I'm Margaret Whitmore. I must say this is all a bit dramatic." Harrison Cole did not smile. He simply inclined his head slightly. "Please, have a seat, Mrs. Whitmore." His tone was polite, but held the unbreakable strength of steel. It was not a suggestion. Margaret, Daniel, and Alyssa took seats at the table, the silence stretching uncomfortably. The suspense was a physical presence in the room, a weight pressing down on them. Margaret's smugness began to evaporate, replaced by a flicker of irritation and confusion. Why were they being made to wait? Where was the owner? She was about to make a demanding inquiry when the double doors at the far end of the room opened with a soft, decisive click. The trap had been set. The final piece was about to be placed on the board. A figure stepped into the room, and for a moment Margaret didn't recognize her. The simple blue linen dress was gone. In its place was a perfectly tailored dark charcoal pantsuit that radiated power and authority. The simple bun had been let down, her hair now falling in a sleek professional style around her shoulders. Her face was the same, her expression just as calm as it had been in the lobby. But seen in this context, under these lights, her calmness was no longer passive. It was commanding. It was the woman from the entrance, the clueless maid. Margaret's mind struggled to process what she was seeing. A chilling stillness fell over her. The color began to drain from her face. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Daniel stared, his eyes wide with disbelief, the pieces clicking together in his mind with a sickening thud. Alyssa simply closed her eyes for a brief second, a silent acknowledgement that their judgment day had arrived. Naomi Carter walked to the head of the table and stood beside Harrison Cole. She looked directly at Margaret, her gaze level and unwavering. Harrison stood. His voice, clear and devoid of emotion, cut through the thick silence. "Allow me to make the formal introduction," he said, his eyes fixed on Margaret. "This is Dr. Naomi Carter. She is the founder and CEO of Carter Holdings." He paused, letting the weight of the name sink in. Then he delivered the final, devastating blow. As of 9:15 this morning, her company acquired the entire Sterling Hotel Group for $300 million. Dr. Carter is the new owner of this venue. Silence. It was not an empty silence. It was a vacuum, pulling all the air, all the sound, all the arrogance out of the room. Margaret's face, which had been pale, now turned a ghostly white. She physically recoiled, leaning back in her chair as if she had been struck. A small, strangled gasp escaped her lips. The world she had so carefully constructed, a world where she was at the top and everyone else was beneath her, had just been demolished in a single sentence. The woman she had insulted, the woman she had ordered to be thrown out like garbage, was not a maid. She was a billionaire, and she owned everything. The floor, the walls, the very air Margaret was breathing. A profound, world-altering horror dawned in Margaret Whitmore's eyes. Naomi let the silence stretch, allowing the full weight of the revelation to crush Margaret. She watched the arrogance crumble. replaced by a dawning frantic panic. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, yet it filled the room with an undeniable authority. It was the same calm voice from the lobby, but now it was backed by the power of an empire. "Mrs. Whitmore," Naomi began, her eyes never leaving Margaret's. "Earlier today, you offered me some advice about the proper entrance for staff. You also shared your opinion that certain people shouldn't be near millionaires. I believe your exact words were that our presence was a matter of hygiene." She recited the insults without emotion, her calm delivery making them sound even more damning. Each word was a precise, surgical strike. Margaret flinched as if she'd been physically hit. Naomi continued, her gaze sweeping over to Daniel, who refused to meet her eyes, and then to Alyssa, who looked at her with a mixture of terror and a strange, quiet respect. "My company has a very strict policy. We believe that the character of our clients is just as important as the size of their bank account. We do not do business with people who show a fundamental lack of decency and respect for others, especially for the hard-working staff who make places like this run." She turned her full attention back to Margaret, whose face was now a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. "Therefore," Naomi stated, her voice dropping to a cool, final tone, "effective immediately, all contracts, memberships, and booking privileges associated with the Whitmore family account across the entire Carter Holdings portfolio are permanently terminated." Harrison Cole slid a single sheet of paper across the polished table. It was a legal notice of termination. The words were stark and unforgiving. Margaret stared at it, her mind unable to comprehend the swift and total destruction of her social standing. This wasn't just about one venue. This was a blacklisting from one of the largest luxury hospitality chains in the world. Then, Naomi did something unexpected. She looked toward the door. "Mr. Davies, would you please ask Emily to step in?" The general manager scurried to obey. A moment later, Emily entered the room, her eyes wide with nervousness. She saw Naomi, now dressed in the power suit, and her jaw dropped. Naomi offered her a warm, reassuring smile. "Emily," Naomi said, her voice softening, "earlier today, when you thought no one with any power was watching, you showed kindness and integrity. That is the kind of character I value. That is the kind of person I want on my team." In front of the stunned Whitmore family, the lawyers, and the venue management, Naomi made her next move. "As of this moment, you are promoted to Assistant Events Manager for this venue, and my personal foundation will be offering you a full scholarship to complete your university degree in hospitality management." Tears welled in Emily's eyes. She was speechless, overwhelmed by the sudden, life-altering turn of events. Outside in the hallway, guests who had been drawn by the commotion were now peering in. Phones were discreetly raised, their small red recording lights blinking in the dim light. The humiliation of Margaret Whitmore was no longer a private affair. It was becoming a public spectacle. Margaret, finally breaking, slumped in her chair. The fight was gone. The arrogance was gone. All that was left was a hollow, defeated shell of a woman, utterly and completely speechless. The sound of her social world crashing down was a deafening silence. The final act was a study in poetic justice. Naomi stood, her presence commanding the entire room. She looked down at the broken woman in the chair, not with triumph, but with a kind of sad finality. This was not about revenge for its own sake. It was about rebalancing the scales. "Let this be a lesson to everyone," Naomi said, her voice resonating with a clear, powerful moral authority. She was no longer speaking just to Margaret, but to everyone in the room, and to the whispering guests in the hall. "Your wealth, your status, your name, they mean nothing. How you treat those you think are beneath you, that reveals everything about who you are." She then turned her focus to Emily, who was still trying to process the scholarship and promotion. "Integrity is rewarded here, Emily. Hard work and decency are the currencies that matter most in my organization." She was setting a new standard, drawing a line in the sand. The old ways of entitlement and abuse were over. Naomi gave a quiet final nod to Harrison Cole. He, in turn, signaled to the head of venue security. The guard, the very same one Margaret had ordered to remove Naomi earlier, stepped forward. He approached Margaret's chair. His voice was professional, but there was no mistaking the command. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said softly, "I need to ask you to leave the premises." The symmetry was brutal. The humiliation was absolute. Margaret Whitmore, the woman who had demanded a nobody be thrown out the back door, was now being escorted out of her own son's wedding reception. She didn't resist. She seemed incapable of movement. Daniel, finally shocked into action, stood up, a weak protest forming on his lips, but a single, silencing look from Naomi Carter stopped him cold. He sat back down, a portrait of impotence. Alyssa watched it all, her expression unreadable. She didn't feel joy, but she did feel a profound sense of release, as if a great weight had just been lifted from her future. Two security guards helped a non-responsive Margaret to her feet and gently but firmly guided her out of the room, past the gawking guests and their recording phones, and toward the same side exit Naomi had been directed 2 hours before. She was being removed, not through the grand front entrance she so prized, but through the discreet, unglamorous door reserved for the staff she so disdained. As the door clicked shut behind her, a new era began at the Sterling Grand Manor. It was an era led by a woman, who understood the true measure of a person. The narrator's voice swells with the final, powerful moral of the story. True power isn't about the doors you can open for yourself. It's about the dignity you afford to every single person you meet, no matter which door they use. And as the world would soon learn from the viral videos of Margaret Whitmore's downfall, you should never, ever mock someone just because you think they have nothing. They might just own everything. If this story about dignity and justice moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories like this one. What would you have done in this situation? Let us know below.